Hello, welcome to the sixth episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming out a little bit delayed this week. I've been wanting to talk to somebody about COVID-19 and the outbreak here, which of course is a bit tricky, given that it's still ongoing and a really difficult situation for many. But I'm happy to share a conversation with Dr. Leigh Jones, head of training at the Oxford Clinical Research Unit here in Ho Chi Minh City. She has a PhD in immunology and is a great resource for all things vaccine related, infection related, just science in general. She's always one of my go-to sources if I have a question about something related to the pandemic. She's a great science communicator, really makes things clear for people like me without a science or technical background. So we talked about vaccines, boosters, ivermectin, some other treatments, and a really science data-driven conversation. Try to stay out of politics and policy. So I hope you learn a lot from this, because I sure did. And let's get to the conversation with Dr. Leigh now. I'm here with Dr. Leigh Jones, head of training at the Oxford University Clinical Research Unit here in Ho Chi Minh City. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be on the podcast. Really excited to have a chat about all things COVID and vaccines. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, of course. I've been wanting to talk to somebody about COVID. I mean, I know COVID is the dominant topic, but I'm glad you were able to come on, and I'm excited about this. So I gave a very brief introduction, but do you want to tell people a bit more about what you do and what your background is?
Sure. So I got my PhD a long time ago, back in 2007, on infectious immunology, so how the body fights disease. And I worked in research for around 10 years after my PhD, first in Scotland and then moving to Southeast Asia in 2010. So I continued to work in research in Singapore at the Agency for Science, Technology and Research, which is a government-run institute in Singapore, working on a multitude of different diseases, really, but everything focused on how our immune system fights those diseases. I moved to Vietnam in 2017, where I started working at OCRU, taking a bit of a different step into capacity building, postgraduate program management, and really getting involved with supporting the future scientists. And at OCRU, lots of those are medics, actually. Lots of them are doctors at the Hospital for Tropical Disease, where we're based. And now that role has expanded slightly to include our sister unit in Thailand, which is the Moru Oxford Tropical Medicine Unit, which does similar jobs to OCRU, but covering different regions. So that's all part of what we call the Oxford Tropical Network umbrella. So working really across the Southeast Asian region and supporting capacity development, which is all aimed towards improving health for tropical diseases.
Okay. Yeah, that all sounds very important. And I mean, you particularly mentioned immune response in your body fighting infections or viruses. I mean, that's obviously very, very prescient right now. And I mean, we've been in touch with each other for a while now. I ask you questions from time to time about COVID related things.
Yep.
And just a note for people, we're not going to be talking about policy related to the pandemic. That's not my expertise. I don't want to speak for you, but we're going to try to stick to kind of a science-based discussion of this. Just try to almost like an FAQ of stuff related to vaccines and treatment and all that everyone is reading about, has a lot of questions about. So just to start, I guess, kind of as a basic, we read a lot about different types of vaccines. There's the mRNA style and a couple of other different types. But when we read that, like, what does that mean for the different types of COVID vaccines?
Sure. So, I mean, vaccines in general, just to take it back one step, are really taking your immune system to training camp, teaching them what the enemy looks like, and arming them with the best weapons and strategy so that when you eventually see the disease for real, your immune system is prepped. So it's kind of like sending in the elite forces. Without the vaccine, you're relying on your immune response to play catch up a little bit. They haven't seen the disease before, so that would be more like sending in the rookies, the new recruits. So that's kind of why I say to everyone, regardless of how healthy you believe you are and how strong your immune system is, send in the elites, don't send in the rookies. So that's really the basics of what vaccines are. in Vietnam, we've had a number of different vaccines coming to our shores, and some of them we're more familiar with and some less so, dependent on where we're from in the world. So, as you already mentioned, the mRNA vaccines, which most of the US listeners and a lot of the worldwide listeners will know more about, these are quite well, objectively new vaccines in that these are the first time these type of vaccines have been used in infectious disease. Not to say they are brand new to scientists. These have been in development for a long number of years, but they're simply kind of like a Snapchat message, which I heard one scientist describe it as, which I think is a really good analogy. You're you're basically giving your body the instruction manual to make a very, very small part of the virus, which is the spike protein, which we are we learn more and more about these words, and it's amazing to hear some of the literacy of the general public now and hearing them talk about these things. But yeah, the mRNA vaccines allow your body to make this spike protein, show it to the immune system. Your immune system gets busy and then has a memory for the next time it sees the virus. So the mRNA vaccines work a bit like that. The AstraZeneca vaccine, which I'm most familiar with being from the UK, and obviously it was very exciting as part of, the Oxford team, because this has come through Oxford University, who then partnered with AstraZeneca to enable high production of this vaccine. Slightly different. It's called a viral vector vaccine. So instead of the genetic material, the mRNA, being delivered directly into your body, it's put inside a different envelope. So the envelope that the AstraZeneca vaccine uses is from another virus. So it's from what we call an adenovirus, which is a common cold virus. And they modify that virus to include the genetic material from the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19. And that genetic material again encodes for this spike protein. So, in essence, again, the vaccine will cause your body to produce parts of this spike protein, which your immune response can then recognize, respond to, and be ready to attack the virus in future. So, that's how the mRNA and the AstraZeneca vaccine works. Sinopharm is obviously the Chinese vaccine, which a lot of the expats in Vietnam, I guess, know a little bit less about. But the Sinopharm vaccine is a very traditional type of vaccine. It's been used, this type of vaccine technology has been used for almost 100 years now. And they basically take the SARS-CoV-2 virus and they disarm it. They kill it, basically. It's a killed or what you call inactivated virus. So rather than showing your body a tiny piece of the virus, you're showing it the whole virus, but it can't harm you, it can't replicate, it can't set up infection. And again,
Okay.
your body will respond to that and create an immune response.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. That's a really good layout of the different types. And I kind of sort of a quick question based on that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this in your group chats and things as well, but I see a lot of people, maybe not as much anymore, but when the rollout was starting here, comparing like, oh, I'd rather have Pfizer or I'd rather have this than that. I think maybe some of the mRNA vaccines are maybe seen as better, seems to be a bit of the perception. And I know I've heard you say many times the best vaccine is the one that's available. But what do you say to people who are kind of like comparing the different types of vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, it's natural when people are seeing sort of data and numbers being reported in the press to start comparing. But I think it's really important to remind everyone that these vaccines have never been tested head to head. These
Mm,
have been trialed separately in different countries under different conditions. Some of them during parts of the pandemic where maybe different variants existed. So it's really, really hard to compare them all head to head. And
mhm,
when the WHO at the start of the pandemic were talking about what vaccines would be effective and what level were they looking at, they were looking at an efficacy rate of 50% as being that sort of benchmark that they wanted vaccines to pass. And all of these vaccines that I've just discussed are above that benchmark by quite a way and
mhm.
remain so even in the existence of the Delta variant. So again, it comes back to, as long as the vaccine which is being offered to you is okay for you. So obviously we do have, some rare conditions where people may not be able to have one vaccine over the other, and that requires speaking to your GP, or, for example,
Hmm.
some vaccines are preferred for pregnant ladies, for example. Then other than that, the first vaccine that's offered to you is the one that you should be taking, and as quickly as possible. Delta is, at fairly high levels across Vietnam, and the most important thing is to protect yourself as soon as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. So sticking with vaccines for now, I mean, we also hear a lot about the time in between your first and second doses, especially with AstraZeneca, since that's still the most widespread here in Vietnam, or widely used. There's been reporting where I think the health ministry is talking about reducing the time to 6 weeks, where I think in elsewhere it's been 8 to 12 weeks generally, but not just for AstraZeneca, but what exactly is the time period in between doses doing? Like what's happening in that time period?
So these durations between doses, they have got quite a bit of wiggle room, and as you said, they've changed a lot in a number of countries throughout the pandemic. Generally speaking, AstraZeneca, in terms of the manufacturers, 6 weeks is still within the time frame, and it's still within that time frame that was tested way back at the start when we had the clinical trials. So 6 weeks is absolutely fine, and you can look at it as, well, you could wait 12 weeks and still get the AstraZeneca vaccine, and it's still going to be really effective. And some work in the UK suggests that they actually prefer that longer time frame. But when we come back to thinking about protection, and given that Delta is fairly prevalent in the community at the moment, um, you could argue that you want to get vaccinated, double vaccinated sooner rather than later. So it's that balance between, okay, is 6 weeks maybe marginally less optimal than 12 weeks, but do you want to wait 12 weeks with just one dose?
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I would say the sort of 6 to 12 week window is anything within that range, really, with AstraZeneca has been used in a number of countries and very successfully. And,
Mm-hmm.
even longer than that looks as if it's still going to produce that robust immune response after the second dose.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's 6 weeks is absolutely within that time frame that the manufacturers suggest.
Mm. Okay. Um, and we're talking about, two shots kind of naturally brings us to the discussions of boosters, which has become, a global topic. Some countries have already moving ahead with that. Others still debating it. I mean, here in Vietnam, we are a long way off from that for anybody. I think we're still under 6% with two shots. So a third shot is, not even need to, not a reality here anytime soon. But what do you think of kind of what's going on with the booster talk? I've seen some reporting this week that I think research in the U.S. Or maybe not just the U.S., but they're kind of showing that two shots are still extremely effective against Delta, and this might not be necessary. I mean, what are you saying in terms of the research?
Well, I think that's a good point. In terms of the research, we're still not seeing a lot of strong evidence that boosters are necessarily needed in, the countries that we're from. I mean, all vaccines, or the majority of vaccines, have some waning immunity over time, and it's really, when does that waning immunity start to get to a point where we need to give people that booster shot? And I know that some countries are already doing that. And sometimes that's based on sort of proxy measures, what we call indicators that the immune response might be
Mm,
starting to wane. Obviously, the most important thing we'd be looking at is, are vaccinated people starting to pick up the disease more frequently? Are they going to the hospital more frequently? But a lot of countries are looking at antibody levels. These antibodies are in your system. They're an indicator that your immune response is there and ready to respond to the virus. And there may be indications, and there are indications, that over time these antibody levels start to drop. But antibodies are only one part of your immune system. So they're certainly not, they're an indicator, but they're not absolutely perfect. So every country will be doing this surveillance of checking to see if there are any signs that these vaccines are starting to lose efficacy. But I think, one of the bigger issues as well, which is a global issue, which is commonly talked about at the WHO and even just, I think last week, Sarah Gilbert, one of the main scientists behind the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, has come out and said, we should be looking at vaccinating everyone across the world before we talk about boosters, because the more people that are unvaccinated worldwide, the more likelihood we have of new variants popping up, and we really aren't safe until we're all safe. So this is why we have this argument over, should we be thinking about boosters just now, or is it more important to redistribute these doses worldwide and get everyone protected?
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, when we talked about this earlier in the week, I think I think you might have mentioned Israel, which is often held up as an example of like heavily vaccinated early and now having problems. But you shared a data point with me that was surprising. Do you want to share that here again?
I'm sure Israel's a really interesting sort of case study, I guess, because they were one of the first countries to have very, very high vaccination rates, and yeah, they are showing evidence that there may be waning immunity. So they've gone ahead and they're going ahead with booster shots, which is absolutely understandable. But I think sometimes when people are looking at Israel, there was an over 80% eligible population vaccination rate. And I think it's important to just look at that in a little bit more context and remind everyone that when they say eligible population rate, that's the adult population who are able to be vaccinated. When you look at the actual population that were vaccinated, it's more like 60%. So when we talk about these herd immunity rates, whether that's actually achievable with Delta, that's another discussion. But certainly that percentage of vaccine coverage is not as high as perhaps some reports indicate. There are some discussion among scientists about whether the sort of 2-dose Pfizer regime in Israel should maybe be lengthened because it was only 4 weeks in between doses. But I mean, this is all conjecture at the moment, and boosters are going to be an individual country based decision. But even looking at that, the hospitalizations are still indicating that the majority of people that are getting really sick, as a percentage of vaccinated and non-vaccinated, it's still a very small percentage of vaccinated people ending up in hospital with severe disease. It can be quite misleading if you look at the numbers in hospital and say, well, actually more people in hospital were vaccinated than unvaccinated with COVID. But if you look at the fact that the majority or a higher proportion of the population were actually vaccinated, then it starts to make sense when you look at the numbers coming into the hospital that you are getting this slightly misleading picture. So it's always more important to remember what we call the denominator, how many people are vaccinated and well versus how many people are vaccinated and sick, and then look at the unvaccinated population. And it may be that the numbers are small in hospital, but actually as a proportion of the people who are unvaccinated, it's actually evident that those vaccines are still giving you quite significant protection against severe disease.
Okay. And something else I wanted to touch on is where it's something that's kind of just getting started to be talked about here in Vietnam is kids, or under 18 at least, because right now Vietnam's only vaccinating adults over 18, given supply shortages, and that's where we know there's pretty safe for older people. But what are you seeing? I mean, this is of course a global issue, but when it comes to kids and the vaccines, what are you seeing at this point?
Well, the Pfizer vaccine and Pfizer have been pushing ahead with clinical trials and younger adults. Started with teenagers, and now they're doing trials from 6 months, actually 6 months old and above, looking at lower doses for very young children. So that's ongoing at the moment. And as far as I'm aware, there's no data come out on that yet. But in the US, as you'll know, the sort of 12 to 17 age range The FDA have taken a really close look at that, and now that's being rolled out and considered. The UK are sort of lagging behind a little bit on that, but there's certainly data coming out to show that certainly in the 12 to 17 age range, we should be looking at vaccinating kids. And I know that, children are not as susceptible, or not as they're as susceptible to getting the virus, but they're not as susceptible to getting super sick. But kids
Hmm.
are still dying of COVID. It's
Hmm.
not it's not no children are getting seriously ill with this, and they can get long COVID as well, which is obviously this more chronic condition that we're seeing where people have symptoms for quite some time. But when you look at the fact that a lot of children are now unvaccinated and unprotected, going back to school in some countries, they are at high risk of picking up that virus, picking up the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And when you look at the sheer numbers of children that will be exposed to this virus, even if it's a very small percentage of children that may get very, very sick and may even die from this, that's still significant numbers.
Hmm.
And we need to look at protecting children. Nobody wants to see sick children. So I think it's definitely something that more and more countries are going to be pushing forward with. And we're all really keen to see how those Pfizer trials are going in younger children. We know that younger children are already being vaccinated against a lot of different diseases. So there's no real reason to think that we couldn't do the same with COVID-19.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I mean, I got all of the usual vaccines when I was a kid in the U.S. I'm sure same for you. So, is this just because these are new vaccines that they need to be tested first?
Yeah, of course. I mean,
Yeah,
every new vaccine
right.
has to go through testing, right? And the initial clinical trials of all vaccines tend to go with that mid-range adults. They tend to exclude children. They exclude pregnant women, for example. We now know that Pfizer have successfully done a lot of trialing in pregnant women and shown that the vaccine is very safe and effective. And of
Hmm.
course, pregnant women are actually in the at-risk category of severe illness. So that's really, really important news, and it's great to see that more and more pregnant women are protecting themselves and their baby as well. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I think having these trials are critical. We don't make decisions to vaccinate children without data, and
Sure.
these are really critical to the decision making of the FDA and health authorities globally.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so now, kind of moving on from vaccines, I wanted to touch on something that's become a real kind of a shocking flashpoint. But is it ivermectin? Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, that's right, ivermectin.
Okay, so I think I messaged you about this maybe 2 or 3 months ago when I first started seeing this name pop up on, well, Twitter mostly, and it's kind of been astonishing to watch it spread across the internet since then. So, want to be apolitical here, science based as possible because this has become again quite a flashpoint. But what is the research showing current? I know there's still ongoing research when it comes to ivermectin, but you're seeing it kind of touted as a miracle cure in some corners. So what is the actual data saying right now?
Yeah, it's a bit frustrating when you get all of this attention on a drug that has not well, when this really started, like you said, a number of months ago. And so ivermectin is an antiparasitic drug. It's a
Hmm.
very effective drug. It's used in people and in animals. It's used against strongyloides, which is an intestinal worm. It's used against heartworm in dogs. It's used against ear mites in cats. It's used against river blindness in humans. So it's a really effective antiparasitic drug. And quite a number of months ago, there was some work came out of Australia that noticed that if you added ivermectin at quite high doses in vitro, which is on top of cells in a dish, basically,
Hmm.
that ivermectin could kill the virus. And these in vitro studies, and you see in vitro studies popping up all the time in popular media, and everyone getting really excited. And it is where science starts. We start with these cells and very basic, start with these drugs or treatments in very basic systems and cells in a dish. But it's important to remember that we aren't cells in a dish. So translating that then into, animal models and then into clinical trials are quite big leaps, and lots of drugs fall at that first hurdle. So these initial studies that showed there was some efficacy in vitro did also warn, and actually the original scientists also said this when they released this data, that in order to achieve the dosage that they were treating with in vitro, it would be well above the highest dose recommended. In fact, almost 10 times the highest dose recommended in humans. And they didn't think they would actually even be able to achieve the level in a human that they could in vitro. So that was kind of an important point to know, and that was kind of put to bed a bit. But obviously, people are still interested in would it potentially have an effect at lower levels. So there are a number of trials. There are still trials ongoing, and it is important that we look at these in controlled, what we call randomized controlled trials, where we compare this drug to a placebo, and it's done blindly so that the person does not know what they're receiving. And this all has to be done in a controlled fashion. A lot of the initial hype when things started to move into sort of real world observational studies where this was starting to be used as a treatment, they're not controlled. So we don't really know for sure whether this treatment is actually having an effect. Then recently, there was a very high profile paper that showed a really strong effect of this drug. And that was then picked up by a number of what we call meta-analysis studies. Now, meta-analyses are basically a study of studies. You take a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials and put them all together and see if there's a consistent effect if you pull all this data together. The problem with meta-analyses is that if you put in garbage, you get out garbage, right? So if you start with bad studies, you're going to get a bad result. So it's really important to look at each of these studies, check them for bias, check them for quality before you put them into that meta-analysis and number crunching. And one of the original studies, the one that I mentioned that had this really strong effect, was massively skewing the meta-analyses in the favour of showing a positive effect. Now, recently that paper was withdrawn. And that's when a lot of these other meta-analyses then fell to the wayside. And the paper was withdrawn because there was evidence of data inconsistencies, of duplicated data sets, duplicated patient data. So it then meant that when the meta-analyses looked back at the studies they'd used in their number crunching and then removed that study, all of a sudden there was no effect again. So that kind of caused a little bit of an uproar and a warning, I guess, to a lot of the scientific community that this sort of quick publication of data is leading to some problems. So it sort of shone a light on some of the things that were maybe a little bit concerning. But to bring it back to ivermectin, we still have some large-scale randomized control trials ongoing. So we wait that data, but up till now, we have no means of suggesting that ivermectin is either a preventative or a treatment that's useful for COVID-19. And that's the line that's being held by pretty much all public health agencies globally, that there is no evidence that this drug works. Therefore, you should not be taking it. And certainly the concern that comes from the high dose issue of in vitro could then be feeding into the problem that, and how true this is, of people maybe looking for ivermectin and getting it in the wrong places, which could be, agricultural places and veterinary stores, because the doses and the formulations that are used in veterinary medicine are not for humans. So obviously that's something that's a concern as well. But we do have a large scale trial going on in Brazil. We've got a large scale trial happening at Oxford as well, looking at the impact of ivermectin on patients who maybe don't have severe disease and are being treated at home, for example, and could it be an at-home treatment? And if it turns out to be positive, it's going to be great because it's a cheap drug and
Hmm.
everyone wants a cheap drug that's going to have an effect. But let's not be misled. The data at the moment says no. So until that says otherwise, we shouldn't be taking things that aren't advised. And,
Hmm.
there is a sort of a desire from some people to believe that because it's cheap, it's somehow being ignored or there's a
Hmm.
conspiracy against it. But just to point out that one of the most effective drugs that's come out of the randomized control trials, particularly at Oxford, and the trial that was ongoing there, looking at different drugs and trying them in patients, was dexamethasone, which has saved a number of people who have severe COVID. And,
Hmm.
that's a simple, cheap steroid. I mean, it's
Right.
being used in hospitals, I would like to say. This is not me saying anyone should self medicate. You absolutely should not. You should speak to your doctor. And if you do have COVID, it's very important to go and speak to your GP. But the
Hmm.
clinical trials there at Oxford showed that dexamethasone was incredibly helpful for very sick patients in the hospital, probably
Yeah.
by controlling the immune response a little bit, which tends to get a little bit overexcited in severe COVID, and that could be part of the reason people get very sick. But again, cheap drug and is being used in treatment in the hospital setting. So
Right.
it's not just about certain drugs being out of favor or whatever. And I think when we get this hype, it's important to look at where that hype is coming from, and is it coming from any solid scientific evidence?
Right.
And I think it's important for us all to remind ourselves to do some good fact checking and look for the data. And if you're not sure, go and ask someone else that maybe knows a little bit more, and be wary, particularly of very emotive language and
Hmm.
conspiracy level language around anything.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning, I mean, keeping in mind, I'm not saying ivermectin will, totally fail. Again, the trials are still ongoing, but last year, I think it was last year at this point, but there was somewhat similar hype around hydroxychloroquine, not even quite this level of hype actually. And that I believe ended up falling by the wayside. Is that correct?
Hydroxychloroquine is, in terms of a treatment, was thoroughly tested, and yes, it's still seen to not have efficacy. There are
Mm.
some, there are still some trials going on to see whether at low doses it could be used as a preventative in some
Mm.
settings. So, for example, healthcare workers. There's a big study being driven by the Thailand unit, actually, the Oxford Thailand unit, called the COP
Mm.
study, which is looking at precisely that as a prophylactic.
Okay.
But again, this is still ongoing, so we wait and see the data. And if
Hmm.
that was to come out, then maybe hydroxychloroquine would have a use. But
Hmm.
currently, in terms of a treatment, no. The
Okay.
data has been quite strong and it's been pretty thoroughly tested.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think that kind of covered most of the questions I had, or that I hear a lot from other people as well. Were there any other points you wanted to make, or anything? I'm sure I missed something, but anything you think of is particularly significant related to this?
I think just to come back to critiquing source, which is really, really important just now, there's a lot of information flying around, and I appreciate that it can be really, really confusing. And there's a really
Hmm.
good saying that's got multiple sort of roots, and I've heard lots of discussion about where it actually came from, but it says something along the lines of that lies fly around the world before the truth has a chance to put his pants on. And that's kind of what we're fighting, which I really like. I don't know who actually came up with it first,
Hmm.
but it's a very old phrase and it
Yeah, that
holds
is
pretty
good.
true. And that's where fact checkers and things are becoming really, really important. So there's some really good tools now on things like Facebook where you can click on to make sure if it's, if this is true or not. They're flagging up information as quickly as they can on social media. Reuters is doing a really good job with fact checking. But
Hmm.
as always, if you've got questions, try and go to a good source. Go to the CDC, go to the WHO, go to the NHS in the UK. There's lots of really good websites there from the top health agencies. And it's really important to use them as your key source of information, whether it's about the virus itself, whether it's about vaccines or treatment. And at all times, if you have questions about your own health, you should be going straight to your medical practitioner. You shouldn't be taking advice from Dave at the pub. Not that we're at the pub right now, which is obviously something that we're all missing,
Yeah.
and certainly not from friends and hearsay on Facebook. Just be very, very careful of what you're reading, and get vaccinated as soon as you can. That's probably my closing message.
Well, that's a great message, and yeah, I mean, I see on Facebook you've been posting some, easy to follow graphics and things like that as well in this, which is really nice to see in terms of science communication. I mean, I know for people like me who are not scientists that it can be hard to kind of wrap your head around some of these concepts sometimes. So I know that what you've been posting has been really helpful. So I hope people are taking some education away from that as well. Well, anyway, Leigh, Dr. Jones, I don't want to be too informal, but thanks for joining
Lee,
me
it's
and
Lee.
for okay. Thanks for sharing this. I hope people take away a lot from this. I know I certainly have. I mean, sadly, these are not topics that are going to go away anytime soon. But yeah, thanks again. Much appreciated.
Really enjoyed it, and I hope people find it helpful. It's been great speaking to you, Mike. Cheers for this. I think it's really important. You're doing a great job and continue to keep everyone informed.
Thank you. I'm trying.